So thank you very much, everybody, for joining us this afternoon. Sorry about the delay in joining the webinar. I had a few technical problems. This is I think about the 9th or 10th webinar we've run during lockdown as part of the SEND Centre for Excellence, and today we're delighted that James has joined us to talk about attachment and developmental trauma awareness. I'm going to hand over to James in a second, but as we go along, if you've got any questions, please pop them into the chat function, and what we'll do is we'll ask James those questions at the end of his presentation. And obviously, if you've got any comments or if you want to share any thoughts as you go along, again, pop them into the chat function. A recording of this webinar will be put onto the Education Training Foundation website, and we'll send that link out to you. So if you, once you've listened today, if you think actually colleagues would be interested in some of the content and some of the thoughts, then obviously you can share that with them. So thanks again for joining us, and I shall hand over to James.
Thank you, Jane. I can't see myself on the screen. Can everyone else see me?
No. So when we're presenting, it's just literally the presentation rather than you.
No problem. Okay, that's great. Thanks very much. A huge welcome to you all. What I'm going to do first, because we've got quite a lot of information to get through, so just going to take you through what we'll be covering today. So we're going to start with introducing the material to you that's going to be covered. And then we're going to talk about some current statistics around the prevalence of trauma in the UK at the moment. I'm going to give you a very little brief history about myself and what I've done over the years in working with developmental trauma. Then I'm going to share with you my first experience of attachment disorder in a class, and share with you a case of Jay. It's more like a memoir really of Jay, and afterwards some of the lessons I learned from working with him and many other young people since. Then I'm going to have a look at some definitions of attachment and developmental trauma. And then I'm going to have a comparison of what a secure and insecure attachment looks like. And we'll need to go back to the kind of infancy of a child, really, which you might find a little bit odd because we're working mostly with college students. But it's really, really crucial to kind of know what happened back at the time when they were an infant. So we'll be going over what is a secure attachment, and then when it all goes wrong, what the young person is likely to present like. Then we're going to have a look at the effects of developmental trauma on the brain. This is quite key at the moment. There's lots of MRI scans now in the last 20, 30 years, which has been fantastic. And so we've been able to really see what's going on in the brain. And we'll look particularly at the fear response as well. So we then move on to have a look at how different attachment styles present in the classroom and strategies to work with young people who've experienced developmental trauma. And I've got a couple of other case studies to go through of students I've worked with. So these were college students I worked with, and just to share with you really some of the things that work quite well. And then just a little bit at the end, hopefully we'll have time about looking after yourself and the potential damaging effects of vicarious trauma. So vicarious trauma, sometimes known as secondary trauma. So when we're very empathic people and we're working with young people, we can sometimes take on their experiences, and that starts to affect the way we see our own world. And we start getting things like anxiety and those sort of things. So really, it's just a very brief look at some of the things to look out for if you're working with traumatized young people, but also some of the things we can do about it. So I think the next slide, please, Jane. Lovely. So just a brief look at the prevalence of trauma in the UK, and just to set the scene really for the talk. So measuring the numbers of people who've experienced trauma is quite a complex thing, as many cases obviously go unreported. However, it is possible to extrapolate the extent of the problem from wider survey findings. So we're just going to share with you some of those findings. So there was a big survey done by Crime Survey for England and Wales in 2019. And that study revealed that 1 in 5 adults aged between 18 and 74 years had experienced at least one form of abuse or adverse childhood experiences, emotional, physical, sexual, or through witnessing domestic violence before the age of 16. So this equates to about 8.5 million people, which is an awful lot of people, I think you'd agree. And then 1 in 100 adults reported experiencing physical neglect before the age of 16. So neglect is a significant indicator that early attachments were disrupted, resulting in ongoing developmental trauma. And this was due to the caregiver not meeting the child's basic needs at a key time in their infancy. Also, an estimated 3.1 million adults aged 18 to 74 years were victims of sexual abuse. Again, a huge number, and that was before the age of 16. And then a different study, which was published in the Lancet Psychiatry Journal, found that 1 in 13 young people experienced post-traumatic stress disorder by the age of 18 years. So PTSD is actually an anxiety disorder that can occur after a traumatic event or events. And the poor person who has PTSD will have horrible flashbacks, horrific nightmares, they will have sleep problems, they will feel irritable, and have a lot of guilt as well, perhaps, for not responding in a different way at the time. And what we know is when people suffer trauma, about 1 in 3 people will suffer post-traumatic stress disorder after a traumatic event. We're not 100% sure why the other 2 don't. There's lots of studies looking at resilience factors and things at the moment, but there's no actual conclusion as such at this point. So overall, when you look at the stats, it's now sort of estimated that in every classroom of about 30 students, there's at least 3 or 4 students who would have experienced or is currently experiencing significant trauma. So that's quite a lot. And obviously the number varies as to where you're working. So if you work in the very deprived areas where a lot of abuse might be going on for the young people and lots of neglect, then that number could be a lot higher. Now, of course, a proportion of young people who have experienced ACEs are being removed from their parents and taken into care. So the looked after status is therefore a significant indicator for us that developmental trauma has occurred. So when we're working in college and we have young children looked after, as they're now called, coming into the college, you need to make a special point of finding out as much about them as possible and having transitions and that sort of thing for them. So what we know is in 2019, there were approximately 99,000 children and young people classified as looked after away from home. So looked after away from home means that they were either in residential care, foster care, or maybe being removed and living with a relative or a friend. And then of this number, 63% were taken into care due to abuse or neglect, and 14% due to family dysfunction. So again, children looked after status is a good indicator that trauma has happened, and that's why they've been removed. Now, we also know that 27% of children looked after have an education healthcare plan for a specific learning difficulty. But obviously, in my experience, that's only the ones who've been picked up. And so there are many more undiagnosed people with learning difficulties, specific learning difficulties, that probably are joining our colleges. And this is why attachment trauma is such a common presentation in SEND classrooms, especially because the young person hasn't developed in the way the plan was, and so they end up probably with something like global learning delay and will need additional help. So it's very much a SEND problem, if you like, or a SEND area to work. Next slide, please, Jane. Lovely. So just want to point out at the moment some the learning aims that I'd like you to go away with at the end. So I want you to, we're going to be exploring what attachment and developmental trauma is. We're to compare secure versus a disrupted attachment, to explore how developmental trauma shapes the brain and interrupts social and academic learning. We're going to investigate common presentations in traumatized children and young people and determine the effective strategies to work with young people exhibiting developmental trauma through developing a specialist support model. So I wanted to share with you, first of all, a little bit about my history. So I started working as a primary teacher many moons ago, so over 20 years ago, I think, in a school in North Somerset with high levels of social deprivation and poverty and unemployment. And unbeknown to me at the time, I met my first children exhibiting attachment and developmental trauma. And I didn't know this because I'd never really come across attachment developmental work other than a little bit on my psychology degree that I did before my PGCE. So I had to become interested in it because there were so many young people displaying traumatic behaviours. So after a few years of doing primary teaching, a role came up in Bristol, which was to solely work with young people with attachment disorder. And it was part of a multi-agency approach to bring in keeping children and young people in care back into county. So at the time, if looked after young people in Bristol, I'd kind of gone through all the provision that was available to them. And because of their extreme behaviours, none of those places stuck. They would then be taken out of county to out-of-county placements. And they were incredibly expensive, so it might be like £4,000, £5,000 a week. And at any time, the providers could just up the fees. And so Bristol wanted to bring these young people back. And so they created this project, which involved a residential home and a multi-agency team, which included clinical psychologists, social workers, child psychotherapists, youth workers, teachers, myself and my colleague at the time, and lots of residential workers as well. So it was a fantastic project to be part of, because when we used to meet and discuss the young people, we had so many different perspectives coming in, and it was a really great job. The young people, of course, were really quite difficult and very distressed as a result of their abusive experiences. But there weren't many of them at one time, which was really good. And I had a porter cabin that they used to come up to, and I used to teach them for about 2 streets away from the residential home. And I learned an awful lot from those and from the professionals I worked with. And during that time as well, I trained as a counsellor, and I wanted to specialise in working with traumatised young people in a therapeutic way, as well as the teaching way. And then I moved to Weston College, where I've worked as a personal tutor and lecturer in the Faculty of Inclusive Learning ever since. I continue to work predominantly with SEND learners with attachment difficulties, but also work with a lot of NEET young people, that's students who are not in employment, educational training. And now I've moved into an advanced practitioner role, and I'm able to work mostly one-to-one with troubled young people across all the faculties. But as part of my role, I also support specialist staff working with young people with SEND and attachment difficulties, and run an ecotherapy group for students to promote positive well-being through nature. And then I also teach mindfulness and anxiety management sessions to a small group of SEND learners. So that's a little bit about my history. And then I just wanted to share this memoir really about Jay. So my very first job in education was to take on an infant class for 1 term only. Mrs. Smith, the previous year 1 teacher, gave me a very brief half-an-hour rundown on the class, which was full of characters according to her. But one lad in particular, Jay, was particularly challenging, she said. I was advised that when he becomes too much, to let him sit in the small porch area for a while to calm down. The following Monday, I met Jay for the first time. He was not what I expected at all, having worked with a number of children with challenging behaviours in placement. His behaviours were much more unpredictable. Sometimes he seemed very needy and wanted to cling to me, obviously in need of connection. But when I tried to provide this, he would pull away and become fractious. His agitated mood would escalate very quickly, and there was no way he could focus on the activities in front of him, not even in play. Jay never made eye contact. He seemed totally oblivious when I tried to correct his behaviours or give him directions. Positive reinforcement didn't work either. Sticker charts were destroyed, good behaviour names on the board rubbed off, and turning the spoon to the sad face served only to wind him up further. Jay didn't get on with others around him. In fact, everyone seemed quite scared of him, as he could strike out at other children without notice. In the first couple of weeks, I felt more like a negotiator than a teacher, attempting to heal the many conflicts Jay had with those around him. But despite my efforts, Jay continued to fall out with everyone, and I was sending him more and more to the porch. So much so, really, that he had a little look of Paul Newman about him, and I kept thinking of this kind of cool hand Luke in this little porch with his baseball. But I found Jay was on my mind a lot too, even in the evenings and weekends at home, when I would grapple with ideas and how to best to help him. So after a few weeks, I managed to get in touch with a social worker who visited with a huge case file on Jay. And I found out that from birth, Jay had suffered severe emotional and physical neglect at home. His mum had mental health difficulties and could not respond to Jay as an infant. Mum's pride and joy were her pet dogs, who roamed the house freely whilst Jay was kept in a room upstairs behind a gate, with little to play with and no human interaction until it was time for him to be fed. Jay was removed by social services for short periods to live with other family members, but then returned home after Mum received the psychiatric help she needed. Things would then improve for Jay for a while, but of course much of the damage had already been done. And if Mum came off her meds, she was again less responsive to him. On hearing of Jay's experiences, I felt huge regret and a bit of shame, really, as each time he was trying to communicate his needs to me through his behaviours, he was sent off to the porch. It seemed like a mini bedroom with no one to comfort him or nothing to play with. I immediately swapped time in the porch for time with the learning support assistant and allotted a small area in the middle room for the two to sit and do activities. It turned out Jay liked to play in the sandbox with little figures, and very gradually he let the LSA play too. The only downside was that for much of the day I lost my LSA from class, but it was worth it as Jay started to settle a little. I would like to tell you that in the final half term, Jay and I managed to turn things around, but this was not really the case, and finally Jay moved on to a year 2 teacher who had much more experience than I. I would see him from time to time the following year, and he still looked like a haunted and very sad little boy, and of course he was. Some 17 years later, I was chaperoning students in enrolments at Weston College when in walked a now much bigger Jay. I introduced myself, but he didn't remember me at all. I felt a bit relieved that my term as his teacher did not have any long-lasting effects, but at the same time, a little short-changed, as I'd thought about Jay a great deal over the years, and he had forgotten me completely. On reflection, however, Jay, along with all the other young people I've worked with attachment trauma, taught me a great deal and have shaped the way I relate to young people in general. I owe Jay a huge thank you. Jay, it turned out, went on to university and was referred to as a gifted mathematician by college staff who taught him. So that was just the very first young man I worked with. And as you can see, I didn't handle it particularly well. And so I put together now a few kind of lessons I learned from working with Jay. So could I have the next slide, please, Jim? So one thing I didn't add to the list that you can see on the screen is just to say that we can actually do a great deal towards helping young people develop through building and modelling positive relationships. It's never too late and never give up. And obviously after meeting me, Jay went on to meet lots of very good attuned teachers and other people in his life. And this obviously helped, and eventually he went on to university, as I said. So it's never too late to never give up. Now, in my view, you know, when attachment and trauma awareness is really essential knowledge for all education staff. Now, and this is also true of young teachers on training courses and young support workers as well. So at Weston College, we run an inclusive practice degree, and we teach attachment awareness on the degree to our people, so that when they go into class or back to their schools, if they're in different ones, they have an idea of what attachment is. We also need to ensure that mentoring for newly qualified staff is in place. I would really have given my left arm for some mentoring when I was a new teacher in that school. There were lots of very experienced older teachers in the school, and that could have been really great for me to talk with them. They would have seen many young people over the years like this. It gave me some reassurance. So again, at the college, we have a mentoring scheme for all new staff generally, and we're putting in place more mentoring for the people who work in SEND, who work with young people with attachment disorder. Ideally as well, to provide educational and clinical supervision for frontline staff. So as a therapist, I go to clinical supervision once a month, and this is really key because I can talk about the young people that I'm working with, and I can talk about how those young people are affecting me and anything getting in the way of me working with them effectively. Also, long, thorough transitions need to be in place for both teachers and learners. So I say teachers as well, because when I went to work with Jay, I spoke to the teacher on the Friday for half an hour, and on the Monday I was teaching the class. And for young infants and young people like Jay, who've had such a traumatic attachment history, he would have bonded to his previous teacher. And then suddenly I arrived and he didn't know me from Adam, and it would have been a real problem for him. But also for our learners, of course. And at the college, we run lots of link courses. So our students come into college maybe once a week or a full day or half a day from year 10. And they get used to the college and they get used to the staff and the people working there. Even the smells and everything at the college is really important, because these can be triggers for young people, especially if they've had attachment trauma and looked after, etc. We also need to ensure information sharing across all agencies. This was a huge plus in the job that I had in Bristol, because we worked with so many different people. It was really, really good. But it always kind of baffles me as to why teachers, especially in teaching staff, are usually the last people to kind of know about the young people coming in, and that other agencies tend to keep the information confidential. Of course, we don't want to know the gory details, but we kind of need to know what the needs of this young person is, so we can design programs to help them. So important to share information, and of course within our team as well. So in college, we learn, we meet the young person, we learn about them, and we put certain information into a profile that's then shared with all the rest of the team. Now, if you can in your college, and we started to do it in ours, you need to employ specialist staff trained in working with attachment and trauma as safe-based workers. So safe-based is a term that was adopted by John Bowlby, who was the founding father of attachment theory. And a safe base is just someone who's going to be there for that young person. So if they go into a session and things don't work out, and their mood they start to become very aroused and they can't self-regulate, then they're going to need a safe-based person. Jane, I think we might have gone on one. So if we could just pop back to the previous one, that'd be that's lovely, thank you. So we need these safe-based workers. So in our college at the moment, we've employed some support workers recently, some specialist support to work particularly with young people with attachment disorder. And they're going to be there and available for these young people for most of the day. We also need to provide physical and psychological nurture whenever possible. So things like breakfast clubs and lunch clubs are really, really essential. Many of our young people are coming into college and they might not have eaten anything that morning. And so nurture is really important. We all know of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and we know that important bit at the base is really essential. But also for people who've had trauma, sometimes managing those difficult times like lunch breaks and things are difficult. So they kind of need a place to go with some recreational activities as well, so they can debrief and have a bit of fun. And some quiet places to relax, of course. And where practical, we need to allot rooms as safe havens for traumatised young people, where they can meet in private with their key person. So if they've had a bit of a morning in a class, they need to be able to come out and talk confidentially to that safe-based person in a place with kind of low arousal, so they can start to bring their moods down. So we also need to know that behaviours in traumatised young people often do not respond to the usual behavioural techniques that we've used. So as when I worked with Jay in that school, I was trying all those kind of positive reward things, and it really didn't have any effect on him at all. He didn't really have an understanding of cause and effect. And so many of these behaviours went ahead of him, really. So that's really quite important as well. And then as an overall approach, this is kind of like a trauma-informed practice. You need to kind of get these things right in order. So our young people need to feel safe in college. So having all those things like transitions, breakfast clubs, safe-based people all help to create a kind of safe atmosphere. These young people are very, very sensitive to any triggers of anything happening in their environment that they don't like. And so safety is really, really important. And after safety, of course, we need connection. So it might be that these young people have never really connected to anyone, especially if they've suffered a lot of neglect. And so that human connection is probably one of the most amazing things we can do for these young people. And by connection, I mean finding out about them, finding about their interests, a little bit about their history. I'm an absolute expert in so many subjects, which range from football to Formula One to Beyonce, even to hair and beauty, which if you saw me, you'd laugh. So that connection is really good. And I go off and I deliberately learn about things that might interest them so we can meet on that level. So connection is very important. And then when we model connection, then the young people will hopefully be able to model connection with their peers eventually. Regulation, also incredibly important, because these young people probably have never learnt regulation. So fear has been left on for them. And when they are feeling scared, they go from 0 to 90 very, very fast. And they go to the top of that, you know, from a very sort of high threshold of baseline, I think that's how you'd say it, to arousal very quickly. So regulation is all about doing those kind of talks, you know, talking in a kind of soft tone, and making sure we can help them come down from their mood. And even using things like mindfulness practice. One of my favourite things is use one of those little pulse ox little machines where you put your finger in and then it gives you a pulse rate and an oxygen level as well. And so what I do is I teach mindfulness to the young people, and then we test them when they come in and they're feeling very aroused. And then we do some calming techniques, and then they take their pulse again at the end. And hopefully they can see that their pulse is gone right down and they're starting to regulate. And over time, and it takes a lot of time, this will gradually start to seep in. And then, of course, when all those three things are in place, then learning can happen. And I put learning last, which seems odd for, you know, someone who works in a college. But the other, you know, learning won't happen without those other three things. And so they're things we need to get right. Sam, did you want to say anything else about anything we offer at college at all? If you wanted to. Don't worry if you don't. No problem. Okay, so what we'll do, we'll come on to the next slide, please, Jane. All right. Lovely. And I just want to look at a couple of definitions, because I've been talking about attachment and developmental trauma, and you might be wondering what it is. So Bowlby gave a fantastic quote, I think, to what attachment is. He said that it's a deep and enduring emotional bond that connects one person to another across time and space. So the emotional bond is everything really in attachment. You know, simply put, that's exactly what attachment is. An emotional bond kind of happens usually within the first 3 years of infancy. But of course, the bond continues for life, and the lessons that we learn from our caregivers go on for life. I still go back and see my mum occasionally when I need some information, and you know, we will always use those people. And as Bowlby said, it does span across time and space. So, you know, if I suddenly move to Australia, the bond suddenly, you know, won't disappear from my mum and won't be my dad. And so that's really important. And time, of course, the older we get, you know, it's important to keep that bond. Now, developmental trauma is the term used to describe the impact of early repeated trauma and loss, which happens within the child's important relationships, and usually early in life. So, so developmental trauma and attachment kind of go together, really. So a secure attachment is fine, everything's great, but an insecure attachment will usually result in developmental trauma. And obviously, being developmental, it does affect us early, but it tends to be a lot of repeated trauma and loss. So it's accumulative. So when we talk about trauma, there's two. It can be split into two, really. There's type 1 trauma and type 2. And type 1 tends to be kind of single event trauma. So it might be something like a car crash and you know, a horrible traumatic experience, but the person survives it, hopefully, and then they come out and they're very supported by their family, and gradually they hopefully come to terms with the memory of it and gradually get back into cars and things. So that would be a type 1 type trauma. Where type 2 type traumas are ongoing. So in developmental trauma, that could be abuse, of course, which is ongoing. and maybe no one comes to the rescue of this young person. So that's what developmental trauma actually is, and type 1 and type 2 differences. Okay, let's move on, I think, to next slide. Lovely. So as I said at the beginning, we kind of need to have a look at what attachment is and what attachment looks like when it goes right. Okay, so attachment actually starts right back in utero, really, when the baby's being carried in the womb, and usually it is the mother who carries the baby. As they walk around, the baby starts to kind of sway slightly in the womb, and that's no coincidence, because when the baby's born, one of the first things we do is we hold the baby and we rock the baby, and so the baby is already used to that kind of motion, and that can calm the baby down. Like that. Also things like heartbeat. So the baby's used to the mother's heartbeat, and when the baby pops out, and your mum would say that, the baby's then held by the mother, and its ear is very close to the mother's heart. And so again, it starts to get the cues that this is a good place, and it can regulate itself with its mother's heart. And things like eye contact as well. So when the baby is actually born, if you're holding a baby, the baby's eyes and the mother's eyes are usually about 12 inches, and that's roughly how far a baby can see at that point. So when babies are born, of course, they're very helpless at birth and need constant care and attention to survive. And so what the baby's instinct is to keep the caregiver in close proximity, and they usually do this through crying. And so, you know, if we have an attuned caregiver and they're secure themselves, then they will come and they will want to deal with the needs of the child in a very consistent and timely fashion. And they'll want to maintain close proximity themselves. So you can see that little diagram over on the left, which is the infant attachment cycle. I think it got a little bit cut off, but it says baby has a need, the baby cries, the need gets met by the caregiver, and then trust develops. So this process goes on, you can imagine, tens of thousands of times in the life of a newborn and to infancy. And over time, the caregiver will attune more and more to what the child needs from them. So they'll start to recognize, is it a hunger cry? Is my baby in pain? Or do they want to play or need some soothing? Now, you know, mothers will and caregivers will get this wrong. They'll misattune. Sometimes they say up to 65% of the time, but this is of no significance whatsoever, because the very act of trying to meet need is more important here. And Bowlby termed a phrase called good enough parenting. So you don't have to get it right all the time. It's just the effort that you're putting in that the child will develop trust in. And along those lines, the infant begins to trust the caregiver, will attend to his or her needs, and then will start to relax and feel happy most of the time. Now, when a child's relaxed and happy, some wonderful chemicals start to cascade over the brain. So we have oxytocin, and dopamine, serotonin, and those sort of chemicals. That will actually make the baby feel really good and happy, and start cooing, and making eye contact with the caregiver and smiling and things. And of course, this is fantastic because it kind of cements the bond then from the adult side as well. And that love and attachment between the two really begins to flourish. And they do what sometimes referred as an attachment dance. And it's a very beautiful thing to watch when a baby and a caregiver are in tune. Now, as the baby begins to develop, it forms a sense of self based on this positive treatment it receives. So it will start to think, well, actually, I'm quite worthy of another's love, and accepts that the world is quite a predictable place and it's quite a safe place. And when I'm needy, my needs will get met. And bit by bit, this will form what's known as an internal working model, which is like a set of schemas or beliefs and assumptions about the world, others, and the self. And I also try and think of this as a kind of like black box in an aeroplane. It kind of carries us through life, really, the internal working model. And we carry it with us, this positive feeling. Jean, can I have the next slide, please? So another thing with attachment as well is when the infant becomes agitated and dysregulated, the caregiver helps the child to calm itself through the use of soothing tone and touch. So if you imagine now the baby's now an infant, and the infant wants to get down and play on the floor, then it goes over and it discovers the dog, and it thinks, well, it'd be really good fun to pull that dog's tail, and they do, and then the dog turns around and growls and barks at them, and for that moment they're really scared, and so then they look for the caregiver. So the caregiver then becomes the safe base for that little toddler, and they'll run or crawl back to the safe base, and the safe base will scoop them up, and they will rock them and comfort them and speak to them in lovely soothing tones, saying, oh, did that dog scare you? Oh, and all that kind of thing. And then, you know, the child starts to calm down, and then looks at the dog, things like, love you next time, and these sort of things. So that's a very important part. It's the safe-based person helps the child regulate their intense moods. But then the infant gets back down on the floor, and then they spot the fire, which has been left unguarded, and they may go across, and they think, right, I'm going to touch that, it looks interesting. And just as they go to touch it, the caregiver goes, stop, like that, and the child freezes in that moment. And in that moment, we actually have a break of the attachment between the two. And this is a very stressful thing for the child, and they're likely to feel very shamed, and the bottom lip will come out, and they start looking at their feet, and they probably start sobbing. And of course, what an attuned, secure caregiver would do is they go over and they pick up the child and hug them and say, oh, no, mummy was really scared that you were going to touch the fire. And they might take them back over to the fire and pretend they were going to touch it themselves and go, you know, that would really burn. And all the time, the infant's watching the parent's face or the caregiver's face and working out, oh, that's right. So this equals, you know, that kind of expression on the face. If you burnt yourself, that would hurt. And little by little, that way, they start to form empathy. So they start to understand how other people are feeling. Obviously, another very important thing of that very process there is when the child felt scared and ashamed, a classical conditioning relationship, you know, they would learn with the fire. So next time when they're in the living room and they think, I might touch the fire, they then think, oh no, I didn't like that feeling last time, so I'm not going to do it. And so social learning actually happens that way as well. So the infant then now is, you know, got empathy, and it knows what empathy looks like. It feels very confident in itself that the caregiver is going to come. They have the ability to deal with intense emotions, and they can start to put in place the social building blocks now to build relationships with others. And at that point, usually the young person goes, or the infant goes off to play school or to main school, and they're very equipped with this internal representation of a very secure attachment. And of course, then they can learn. And we also know that at birth, the infant has 100 billion neuronal cells in place. So that's more than they'll ever need ever again in their life. And all these neuronal cells are out there on their own, really, but they're ready to connect up. So a secure and nurtured development with love and consistency and positive modelling would allow the synaptic growth, the linking up of all these neuronal areas to happen throughout the brain. And these areas can then develop social, and from these areas, the infant can then develop social understanding, language, motor movement, empathy, executive functioning, things like planning and learning, and abstract thinking as well. So this little child now is really equipped for learning. Can I have the next slide, please? But sadly, you know, when a little person had suffered abuse or neglect, the attachment can go very, very wrong. And in these cases, the child is not equipped to go to school. And some of the causes of these poor attachments could be to do with the parent or the carer not having experienced a very good or complete attachment themselves when they were small. And so they really haven't learnt how to parent. Some people say that from the moment the baby's born, it's learning how to parent. And so this might not have happened for these parents now. Of course, it can also happen from adverse childhood experiences, as we've looked at, so things like neglect, physical and emotional abuse, and domestic abuse. It can also happen from the parents suffering from poor mental health. So that little infant is looking to that parent to turn on these little switches in their brain, but because of perhaps the parent suffers from depression, for example, they're going to be unresponsive and unavailable to the infant. Drug use in the parents or caregivers is also a major problem, and kind of gives an ambivalence really to parenting, because one minute they might be drunk or high and they're playing with the child and everything's really great, and then all of a sudden they're coming down from alcohol or drugs and pushing the child away. Caregivers living in extreme poverty, unable to provide the sustenance maybe to the child, and also for economic reasons. So maybe caregivers need to work long hours and the infant's left with less responsive siblings perhaps, or something like that. So there are many more causes as well, but for time, that's some of them. Could I have the next slide, please? So when these children feel fear and hunger and discomfort, just as the secure children did, the carer is not available to them consistently. So the little diagram on the left, the baby has a need, baby cries, need doesn't get met by the caregiver, and mistrust develops. So the baby cries, but no one comes. Or if they do, they respond in maybe a horrible way by shouting and screaming at the child, or hitting the child, or shaking them. And then the child in this state will form emotional dysregulation, and this becomes the very normal state. The child becomes hyper-aroused, so very difficult to settle. They're not getting any of those lovely chemicals that make them feel good. And sometimes they go hyper-aroused, which means that things are so traumatic for them that they decide that they're going to go out alone and they're going to shut off in the world. And they go into this kind of inner world, which is really distressing to see. And of course, where the secure child had this really positive internal working model, a little black box inside them, these young children and young people have negative internal working models, which form the view of the world is a very dangerous place, and as people is untrustworthy and abusive. So many of these memories we know now are stored pre-verbally as well, because if this happens before our language regions of our brain come online, we only store them in a kind of sensory way. And so sometimes when we have those young people in our class and they suddenly react to what seems like a really innocent trigger, when they come down, they might not be able to articulate as to why this happened. They might not know themselves of why this trigger particularly sent them off the deep end. And so that's because the memory is sensory and not cognitive. And of course, a child in this situation starts to live in a state of perpetual fear and trauma all the time. Next slide, please, Jane. So living in this perpetual fear really has major implications on the developing brain. So this is our brain here. One theory of brain development is called the triune theory of brain development. And this is an evolutionary theory that suggests that the rear part of the brain, that part of the back with the brain stem and that fawn-coloured cerebellum, those areas of the brain there formed evolutionary-wise quite early on, and it's known as the reptilian brain, because that's all to do with fight and flight. So if you happen to disturb a lizard, the lizard will see you and scamper off. Or if it sees another lizard, it might want to fight it. And those responses are there in that part. And then that area in the middle is often called the mammalian brain, where the area where the amygdala is. And that, when reptiles moved into becoming mammals, then we needed other emotions. We need to stay near our young longer and things like that. We needed those bonds. And so that part of our brain started to develop. And then when we became Homo sapiens and, we started to build colleges and fill colleges with lecturers and things like that, then the prefrontal cortex started to develop, last of all in the brain on there. So that's triune theory of the brain. And one interesting area in the limbic system is the amygdala. That's that little green area there. It's the shape of an almond, about the size of an almond. And we got one in each hemisphere of our brain. And what happens is when a child has had adverse childhood experiences, they'll start to become locked in that area of the brain a lot more. So, and the amygdala will start to become very, very sensitive, because the amygdala is a little bit like an alarm system, and it's always scanning for danger, and it's always wanting to alert the person if there's any danger. Now, another good analogy for the amygdala is to think of it as a smoke detector on the ceiling of a kitchen. So it's on that ceiling, and if you happen to burn a little bit of toast, the smoke alarm will go off. But also, if the kitchen's fully on fire and the house is about to burn down, the smoke detector will also go off. So it can't differentiate between what sort of smoke it is. And it's very true of the amygdala as well. So the amygdala will start to see any cue, any little trigger in the environment as a threat if you suffered these early traumas as an infant. And so what happens then, of course, is all the energy goes to that part of the brain. And just like if you went to a gym and just, did weights with one arm, that arm will grow very, very big, and the other arm will probably waste away eventually. And this is very true of the brain as well. So the amygdala will trigger the fear response, and it will let the brainstem and cerebellum know that there's danger. And that will activate what's called the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system has two divisions to it, the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. So fight or flight, that we probably all know about, is a sympathetic reaction to fear. So the body starts to prepare itself for trouble, starts pumping blood to limbs so it can fight or run away. Breathing becomes much more rapid, the heart starts beating a lot more, and the body is reacting to this fear. So in these traumatized young people, their body is reacting all the time. And then what the body does is it starts to flood the system, not with those lovely chemicals now, but with adrenaline and cortisol, which are chemicals to help with that response of fear and fighting flight. And so, unfortunately, when someone's fear responses are left on, the cortisol and adrenaline will start to shape the brain and will stop connections happening in the brain to other little parts. So it really becomes a problem. Now, there is a response in the parasympathetic region as well, which is the freeze response. And so parasympathetic usually calms us down. Sometimes if we start to breathe slowly when we're feeling traumatized or anxious, and then we start to recover. But another strand of the parasympathetic system is this freeze, where someone actually just freezes and can't operate. It often happens in trauma. Could I have the next slides as well, please, Jane? So unfortunately, the longer the brain is involved in managing threat, the less attention is paid to growth in other areas of the brain. And so the child's development in areas such as speech and social ability and motor movement, executive function, etc., will be inhibited. And this is due to lack of synaptic growth to these regions of the brain, because all the energy is being put into the fear part. And it means that developmental milestones are delayed or never met. So if you have a little look at that scan, it kind of always knocks me off my feet. You have someone who's had quite a secure attachment there on the left, and then we have someone who's experienced extreme neglect on the right. And you'll just see the sheer size difference of just less growth in the brain. And there's lots of bits in that brain that would be missing completely as well. Now, the brain also undergoes this quite amazing process where it starts to regularly prune certain times of our life. A very big pruning thing around about 3 years old. And that's where the brain will go out and say, right, what am I needing? What am I using? And if it's not using something, it will reabsorb that synaptic pathway back into the brain because it's just not using it. So the old saying, kind of use it or lose it, happens. And so if that child, that developing child, is not getting that nurture and all those switches switched on at the right times, and developmental isn't development isn't random. It comes on at certain times, like speech kicks in, maybe around 18 months or something. Then if that's missing, then the child's going to have serious learning problems. And that's why global learning delay, among other learning difficulties, are very common in people who experience developmental trauma. Okay, and next slide, please. Lovely. So we now need to look at kind of what all this tells us about the young person in front of us. So that was all infant stuff. And now we've got this 16 or 17-year-old person screaming and shouting and swearing, destroying things in front of us. Well, how are they seeing the world? Well, of course, they're seeing the world as an unsafe and mistrusting, they're going to be mistrusting of others around them. They're going to be unsure if their basic needs are going to be met. Are they going to be fed? Are they going to be cared for? Are they going to be made to look silly, shamed in some way? They may be unable to regulate those intense emotions such as anger, hurt, jealousy, and disappointment. So whereby, we might have a college trip planned and it gets cancelled, and all those securely attached young people go, well, it's disappointing, but, we'll go again. For that young person, disappointment is just too massive, and it might end up in them lashing out or destroying things. And they might be unable to articulate those feelings. They might never learnt that vocabulary of empathy. And they might really struggle with their speech anyway, because those areas didn't come online when they needed to. So to show their communication, they might start destroying property or lashing out with things. And they might also have an ability to feel the empathy for others. So when they've hit them, they don't really understand what they're worried about. They were there, don't understand why they're upset, because those little areas are never developed because they never had that responsive caregiving to learn that empathy. They might fear that the trusted adult will forget about them and not hold them in mind. Something we call permanency. And we have to work hard at making sure that they know that we're thinking about them most of the time. And they're also perhaps afraid to let their guard down and get too close to staff members, because when they've done that in the past, they got rejected, and that's very shame-inducing. Maybe they're unable to relax and switch fear centres off in order to access higher brain functions requiring learning. And so sometimes, to avoid looking or being shamed by not being able to partake in the learning activity, the young people might decide then challenging behaviour is the better thing. So if we can move on to the next one now, please, Jane. Now, I'm aware of time is moving on, so I'm not going to go through all these by any means, but these are just general signs of attachment and developmental trauma in class. So we have lots of different ones. So if you might want to just have a quick read through those, and perhaps maybe put in some comments a bit later on about any of these that you're not sure about. So I'll leave you to read that a second. You'll have a drink. Just to point out a couple of them, one there is called the erratic progression in learning. Now this is often due to the traumatized person spending a lot of their time in their brain in survival focused areas. And so they're unable to access, like we mentioned, those prefrontal cortex areas where learning happens. But sometimes, of course, they might be feeling better about life in general, and maybe things are a bit calmer at home. And so for little whiles, they might be able to just access those regions of the brain where they can start to learn. So it might be teaching them times tables or something, and they kind of understood that at the time. And then, next day, because something happened overnight, like, mum hit dad or dad hit mum, then the next day they're in a very different place in their brain and wouldn't be able to recall that information again. And it can be very confusing for teaching. It used to confuse me a great deal why 1 minute they can have that. And then the other thing as well was stealing. So stealing can be the result of early deprivation, of course. So stealing food and stashing it in bedrooms and things was very common in residential homes. Quite often when staff went up to maybe clean the young person's room, they'd find lots of packets of bacon under the bed and things. So this obviously comes from a place of not knowing if you're going to be fed when you're little. But stealing can also result out of wanting to make and keep friends. And so a young person might steal things to give to these potential friends as gifts. But stealing can also become very addictive, and will need addressing in the same way as any addiction, really. So just a couple I picked out there that I thought I'd explain. So we can move on to the next one now, please, Jane. So when the internal working model is in place, it comes by a kind of response to the infant's unique set of circumstances, really. So every infant's circumstances are different. And this is happening obviously during the crucial attachment years. So the child will start to adopt an attachment position or style based on the perceptions of the care he or she receives or does not receive. And so we managed to classify kind of 4 styles. So we have the secure style, which is fairly obvious. Then we have the insecure ambivalent, the insecure avoidant, and the insecure disorganized. Can I have the next slide, please, Jane? So I thought I'd go on now to have a little look at these in turn, and then offer you a couple of case studies, which I'll read through fairly quickly because we're moving on in time. So this particular one here is securely attached young person. So it speaks for itself, really. So this young person in the classroom, they kind of want to have a relationship with the teacher. They want to, do well for the teacher and kind of get rewards off the teacher and that sort of thing. But they also don't want to have any relationship with the task, and they're quite happy to get on with their work. And the teacher will often meet the pupil as well in the task and give them lots of positive feedback and that sort of thing. So the securely attached child is pretty well off in school. Can I have the next one, please, Jim? So the avoidant style young person is a very different thing. So young people with this style of attachment have experienced rejection in the past when trying to get their needs met as infants. So at some point they've unconsciously decided to try and go it alone so as not to rely on caregivers who were emotionally or physically unavailable to them. So by the time such young people reach college, they're very fearful and unwilling to form relationships with staff and other young people through fear of rejection. So as a survival strategy, he or she may be rejecting of others, and the young person's behaviour can be rude and obnoxious, and there can be very little engagement, especially in subjects with a group working element. And so by the diagram, as you can see, a pupil wants very little to do with the teacher. It doesn't want a relationship, but quite often will meet the teacher in the task. And these young people quite often are quite good at maths and things like that. They like that problem-solving idea, nothing too abstract, or they can kind of see end results to formula and things. So I just want to share a very quick case of R. So I was a 16-year-old female student with a history of being very withdrawn and uncommunicative. The social worker said that for the first few years of R's life, she lived with her single mum, who was an alcoholic and drug user. Mum also suffered from depression and was often unresponsive to R. After a particularly heavy drinking session, Mum would pass out for hours and R was left with nothing to eat or drink and no one to hear her cries. R eventually stopped crying, which is always a very worrying development. The maternal grandmother would look after R at times, but then argued with R's mum, and the relationship broke down. So at age 8, R was taken into care and had a number of placements until she eventually settled into a placement that had lasted 4 years. In a rare sharing of information, R said that she couldn't wait to move out of foster care as soon as social services would let her, and she planned to move back with her mum when she could. This is really not unusual. So quite often teachers and carers get all the kind of negativity that you'd think the young person would have towards the parent, but kind of recognising the fact that your parent didn't want to parent you or couldn't parent you is a very shameful experience. So quite often young people in care will pedestal their actual birth parents and take it out on other professionals who are kind of working with them, really. So in class, I was seen distant and uncommunicative. She would not maintain eye contact for anything other than a brief second, and then would look off towards the window. It was apparent that she wanted no relationship with staff or peers, and would spend break and dinner times on her phone, looking at YouTube clips alone. I would start tasks quite well, but would often destroy the work before handing it in. In group tasks, she was happy to record answers and quizzes, etc., but refused to take part in group discussions or tasks where she needed to give her own opinion or share things about herself. Sometimes I produced some excellent work, and this would make the hand in. Attempts to praise her as a person were not successful, however, and she would switch off or say whatever in a huffy manner. This was confusing to staff who were trying their best to make her feel good about herself and build confidence. I was seen most content when she was filling in worksheets and would do pages of sums in maths very accurately. If more complex tests were introduced, I would give up very easily, however, and spend the rest of the session playing with her phone. And when asked to put the phone away, she would pretend she hadn't heard, and after many times of insisting, she would swear under her breath and eventually comply. So what was happening for R? Well, R had been let down badly, of course, by her caregiver as an infant, and learned not to trust others. She gained some feeling of control when she could predict outcomes herself. So although shutting down meant that R could not enjoy the pleasures of intimacy, it was safer for her to do so, so she didn't feel rejected. And she would also reject any attempts at building relationship with others. So what worked for R really? Well, it was really important to try to build a relationship with R very gradually, and equally important not to give up despite her objections. So it's so easy to give up with avoidant young people because they seem happier to just be on their own. R wanted only to focus on the task, and so this is where we started. So in our one-to-one tutorials, I introduced number puzzles and riddles, which she quite enjoyed trying to work out. R allowed me to give her some tips to solve the problem, which seemed like progress. And R and I could meet in the puzzles, and this would feel safe for her. I was also quite fascinated about magic, and so I performed a few tricks I knew, and she worked them out, how I did them, and got great pleasure out of doing that. And then she started to look up tricks of her own, which she performed for me. I felt we were making a real connection here. When tricks worked out, I showed my amazement, but didn't really overplay it, nor would I give her lots of praise. So when I occasionally forgot this rule, I could see her literally recoil away. So when tricks didn't work out, or solutions to number puzzles, etc., I tried to convey some empathy for her. God, it's really disappointing when it happens, isn't it? I'm guessing you really like it when it works out the first time. I don't believe anyone had ever tried to convey how she was feeling before, and I would often look quite stunned and not sure what to do with that. She would give me very little back, so I didn't know if it was going in or not. But one day a great breakthrough came when she decided that she was going to start the lesson with a card trick for the students in the class. And it worked first time, and the other students even clapped at the end. So I then sat motionless and refused to take part in the rest of the lesson. I believe she kind of lowered her defences that day just for a little bit, which was very scary for her. And then she reverted to the safety of her old methods of coping, which is really not uncommon. But as time went on, I gradually began to connect with staff and other students on the course and allowed others to help her more. And, she made progress. And eventually at 18, she left college to get a job. And last I heard, she was back living with her mum. With all accounts, got her life together again. So, that was someone who had an avoidant style. If we can move on to the next one now, Jane. So an insecure, ambivalent style, it very much works on the pupil really wanting a relationship with the teacher or support staff, but not wanting a relationship with the task at all. And the insecure ambivalent style develops from a relationship with a parent who is inconsistent and unpredictable, sometimes meeting the needs of the child if in a good mood, whilst at other times ignoring the child's needs completely. So the child will attempt to use any means possible to force the attachment with the caregiver, resulting in clingy, seemingly manipulative and coercive behaviours. So I've got another case study of a young man called H. And H came to his interview and was very chatty and amenable. He shared a lot of information of a sensitive nature within the first 15 minutes of meeting me. He told me that when he was a toddler, his birth mum had numerous short-term but intense relationships with male partners. The relationships often followed the same pattern, with mum falling deeply in love with her partner, and then in a few weeks or months, the relationship ending, usually with violence, which H said he witnessed each time. At the deep in love stage of the relationship, H's mum was not available to H, and he was often left unattended. As the older sibling, he would take on the responsibility of looking after his younger sisters. One particular horrible time, H was playing in the living room, and an abusive partner came through the door and grabbed a knife, and H's mum grabbed his two younger siblings and took them into a bedroom and locked the door, and poor H was left in the living room with this man, who thank goodness didn't harm him, but was obviously incredibly traumatized after. So those were the sort of experiences H had. So H presented as a very friendly, sometimes overly friendly young man. Soon into the interview, he asked me many personal questions about my own life, which I needed to respectfully deflect. He was very agreeable in choosing his timetable sessions, going along with my suggestions and having a few ideas of his own. When H started college, he was always waiting for me outside of the office. Each time he had something urgent of a personal nature he needed to share with me, but quite often this turned out to be nothing of any substance. He also turned up most breaks and lunchtimes too. So in class, he was a student who called out a great deal and talked over others. He was uncomfortable if I was working with another student and would tap on the table repeatedly until I needed to tell him to stop. Shortly after, he would start to talk loudly to students next to him, and again, I would need to remind him to speak quietly. H would then be quite sarcastic and rude in his response. I tried planned ignoring, but this had the opposite effect, and H would up the ante until I could ignore him no more. And although none of H's behaviours were particularly serious, the cumulative effect was quite disruptive to the rest of the class. So when I checked in on H to ensure he was on task, he had rarely produced much in the way of work. In one-to-one tutorials, however, H was focused, happy and relaxed, and he never missed a meeting. So what was happening here? Well, given H's history, I deduced that he was probably operating from an insecure, ambivalent attachment position. As a child, his caregiver was inconsistent in her care, and H needed to work hard to keep himself on his mother's radar. H was more able than he let on, but needed to seem helpless in an attempt to foster mum's help and attention. Given the transient nature of different stepdads in H's life, he learned to become familiar and friendly very quickly. His superficial behaviour was probably a means of ingratiating himself to these strangers in order to be in favour and remain safe. This survival strategy remained paramount and explains H's need to get overly familiar with staff. At school, H was labelled as attention-seeking and manipulative. He was deemed to have a low attention span and could not work independently. He was also seen as lazy. But in my view, H was seeking attention, but for very good reason. At college, as H's tutor, I was a significant caregiver, and he needed to know that I was keeping him in mind and consistently respond to his needs. Although at age 16, H was reacting as a scared 3-year-old. College was a stressful environment for him, and when stressed, he would fall back on familiar strategies used to try to meet our needs in early infancy. So living in such a hyper-aroused state due to domestic violence he witnessed, it was no wonder H could not focus on his work. First and foremost, he needed to feel safe in the college environment. Such young people have little interest in the task of a lesson. They seek only to keep close proximity to their chosen staff member, needing constant reassurance to feel safe. If their behaviours result in negative attention, this is definitely better than none. So how I work with H? Well, H needed to know I'll be there for him, and so I set up an official 10-minute check-in each morning at 9 a.m. and a check-out at the end of the day. He could also come and see me during the day, so I became his secure base. I also taught H breathing meditation to use when he was feeling anxious. This became a weekly practice in tutorial, and H was encouraged to use the method when he felt stressed to regulate his anxiety levels. I recruited another staff member as a safe-based person if I was ill or pulled away, and let H know that the staff member would keep me updated as to how he was doing. I spent lots of time finding out about H's enjoyments, his family history and dreams and aspirations. I wanted him to know I was genuinely interested in him, so hence the connection. I made a point of telling H I was thinking about him outside of college. I was watching Bristol City on TV the other day and was hoping you were watching too, because I know you're a supporter, those sort of conversations. In session, I set H small time tasks and little mini goals to encourage him to start and finish tasks. I passed on this information to colleagues in other subjects. H used his phone to time the tasks. When the alarm went off, I agreed to come back to check his work. And this helped with his regulation and made him feel safe. If I was delayed or could not make meetings, I'd give as much notice as possible and apologise, whilst acknowledging how difficult it might have been for him when I'm not there, when he needs to talk. And I asked the support worker in the room not to overhelp H and to encourage him to find things out for himself, because it was important to develop H's independence and self-confidence. So over time, H started to settle more. Sometimes he would not turn up for his catch-ups, preferring instead to spend time with friends. He started to focus more on tasks and eventually done away with the timer. Progress was not linear, and we needed to revert back to safety, connection, and regulation in that order when things in his life had gone wrong. Could I have a new slide, please? Lovely. And then we come to the final style, which is called the disorganized attachment style. Now, you might have noticed that through these slides, we've had pictures of infants on here. And that was purposeful, really, because, again, it's that bit of thinking about that infant, thinking about what they were like and what their life was like when they were being brought up. And we have to keep going back to that time and time again. And this is, no more the case than with young people who are displaying disorganized attachment styles. For these young people who've experienced a great deal of physical abuse and neglect and may just be too chaotic to form a particular attachment style, and so will oscillate between avoidant and ambivalent. We call this like a push-pull behavior. So I need you and I need to avoid you at the same time. So it stems from the tension between needing the caregiver for survival whilst being scared of that person because he or she is abusive. It's very common in children and young people who have witnessed or received domestic violence. And the domestic violence victim may model this same dynamic with the violent partner as well. So this kind of modelling the infant picks up on. Disorganised young people are likely to be extremely intense, violent and controlling. And because of this, many young people end up in alternative provision away from the mainstream colleges and schools. So I haven't done a case study with that particular because I think you might be case studied out. So just to talk very briefly about some strategies in class. And just to let you know, a really good author on this is a lady called Mary, got her name actually, so it's Mary Delaney, that's right. And she has a chapter in a book called Teenagers and Attachment. And she goes through a lot of this stuff in there. And it's a fantastic chapter and well worth a read if you're working with young people who are traumatized. So strategies in class. Well, this pupil, of course, they don't want a relationship with the teacher, but also they don't want a relationship with the task necessarily. And so it's very difficult for the teacher to meet them on either plane, really. So, arguably young people with this attachment style are likely to be very demanding on staff. So good support networks are really crucial. You need that clinical or educational supervision when working with these young people. Due to potentially abusive behaviours towards you as a staff member, it's often a good plan to work in pairs as a tag team. So if you're starting to find yourself getting a little wound up yourself, a little bit overly aroused yourself because someone's screaming in your face or throwing stuff at you, the other person come along and tag you out and say there's a phone call or something, and you go off and do it, and then they'll carry on and you'll come back when you're feeling a bit calmer. Disorganised young people need structure and routine, so this is so essential for these young people. And they will challenge these rules, but in the end the rules will become the structure in itself. So you do need to have that in place, and eventually they will come round. You need to manage changes to the day very carefully. So if you've got to go off somewhere and supply teacher comes in, you need to let them know as soon as possible. And maybe even give them the option not to stay in that day, to come out and maybe spend time with their secure base out of session. You need to bear in mind that the disorganised young person will almost certainly be operating at a developmental age much, much lower than their chronological age. So the way you speak to them is also very important, of course. Don't use technical language or complex language. Be succinct and to the point. You also need to be quite firm and firm in reinforcing boundaries. And if challenging behaviour begins to escalate, ensure you take the young person to one side to avoid triggering further shame. Yeah, so that's the disorganized young person. And I just wanted to now just explain that a lady called Miriam Silver in another fantastic book called Attachment in Common Sense and Doodles, a Practical Guide. There's an excellent chapter in there about what she calls the tug of war of attachment. So as a secure person ourselves, hopefully, we're on this end of the rope, and we're trying to pull the avoidant and the ambivalent young person into a secure position. But of course, they want what's familiar to them, so they're trying to pull us into theirs. And we're also trying to pull that young person with disorganized relationship into a slightly more organized attachment, which could be the ambivalent or avoidant position. And that would be a really good step. But all the time, of course, they're trying to pull us back into the disorganized position. So from this very tug of war, this is when we can maybe experience vicarious trauma. So vicarious trauma affects us the way we see the world and the way we experience ourselves, and also our relationships with others, because we start to pick up on those traumas of these young people who have that same difficulty relating to those three things. So we might start to feel anxiety and dread about meeting the young person. We might get irritable ourselves. Our sleep might suffer. We might start to feel really sad or very angry, even though we didn't used to before. We sometimes get intrusive thoughts of what happened to that young person. We worry about them a lot. Our concentration might suffer. We start to feel maybe a little fearful about what's out there, in our very secure world before we're now starting to question it. And we start to get those kind of detached feelings, sometimes feel like we're floating off from our body. Normal stress symptoms as well, like headaches and poor memory can follow us, and also changes in appetite. So if you're getting any of those and you're working with these young people, start to really try to take hold of this. And some of the ways of doing that is to try and sort of take care of yourself emotionally, so engage in some relaxing, self-soothing activities yourself. I highly recommend mindfulness, maybe yoga, tai chi, that sort of thing. Have a long bath with candles, whatever kind of floats your boat, to nurture yourself. And also to look after your physical and mental well-being is really, really essential. So get lots of breaks from work, maintain that healthy work-life balance. Have interests that have nothing to do with work. That's really important. And also be realistic about what you can accomplish. We're only one person in these young children's lives, and we might only have them for a year or two. So there's only so much we can do. Seek social support from colleagues and family members. Use a buddy system, particularly important for less experienced teachers and support staff. And use peer support and opportunities to debrief whenever you can. And like you have today, and I really appreciate you doing it, take up any training opportunities to learn more about attachment and trauma in these young people. And that's it. So I just wanted to say a huge thank you for listening, and to ask you to remember that, through your care and effort, you really are helping these young people more than you might think.
James, thank you so much. That's been an absolutely fascinating webinar, and we've got some comments in the chat. And unfortunately, a few people have had to leave, but they have left questions, and I think everyone would agree. It's been a really informative and insightful presentation. So thank you so much. We've got a few minutes left, so if I could just maybe put some of the questions in the chat function to you, and then obviously maybe what we'll do is take those out of the chat function and put them in a document as well that you can respond to, and we'll send those out after the webinar as well, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
Is that all right? Brilliant. So we've got a question about obviously the behaviours that you talked about earlier, and a question from Adam was, could these behaviours come from the death of a parent or the introduction of a step parent?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, the behaviours would be very, very similar. Death of a parent especially, depending obviously when it's happened, and the support network around that child. So we often talk about relational trauma as well. So that's where what support is available for the young person when they've had a trauma. So yeah, could very much be that. Introduction to step parents, that will really throw things into disarray for that young person, especially if the previous parents got divorced, And so they would show many of those behaviours without a doubt. So in anxiety, their world's being rocked in a similar way. But if they've had a fairly secure relationship early on with both caregivers, they will usually survive that and hopefully won't experience the traumatic things that people with developmental trauma suffer.
Thank you. And another question from Peter about, I'll read it out, in terms of the policy and procedure, especially related to conduct behaviour intervention, how have we segregated our inclusive approach to attachment and developmental trauma with established concepts of discipline, especially with non-specialist staff? This might be one that we need to think about and come back to, send out afterwards, but have you got any kind of key points on that you can give to us?
Very, very, very good question. I think what's certainly very important in any disciplinary policy in a college or school is that it kind of allows for these difficulties of the young people and provides lots and lots of second chances, third, fourth, fifth chances. They're absolutely going to need that because they're going to make mistakes because they lack that ability to be able to regulate themselves. So I don't know if that helps, but yeah, it's very, very important to have those things in place. And unfortunately, especially with the more disorganized attachment style, where the behaviours are going to be very intense and sometimes quite frightening, the young person's behaviour actually catches them up. And so they often do get excluded because things can't be ignored if they start setting fire to things and things like that. And in that way, maybe your college and mainstream isn't the right place for them at that point. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, there's another question actually linked to that from Sarah. She said that she works with adults with experience of homelessness, and many of them have experienced trauma in childhood, but are now older. So the average age of her learners are between 30 and 50. And her question is, are there any resources, studies or books that you would recommend for working in a trauma-informed way for older adult learners? And I don't know actually whether some of the references that are on the screen might cover that, or whether there's any additional ones that you might recommend.
Yeah, very, very good point. I mean, one of the reasons we tend to sort of study infant attachment cycles is because usually this is when the problem comes into fruition, really, and the bits that are missing in development play out for the rest of our lives. So pretty much any book on the subject is very useful. And it's just bearing in mind that even in someone, 30, 40 or 50, there would be that little traumatized child inside. And so we need to relate to these people in a very certain way that we talked about in the presentation. But an excellent book, which doesn't really relate to that age group, but an excellent book, and one that I'd recommend to everyone I speak to, is Building the Bonds of Attachment by Dan Hughes. And it's a fantastic book, and it follows a little girl through care, through the care system, and how she goes to live with foster carers and the impact on her life. And that was really fascinating read. And at the end, Dan Hughes also does a very good commentary about attachment in general, and the needs of child. So that is a really good book. But yeah, I can't think of any from an adult point of view, to be honest with you.
Maybe when we send out the an email afterwards with the link to the presentation, if we can pop the some of those additional references in the email, that would be really helpful. We've just got one more question in the chat, and that's about how difficult is it to distinguish between mental health challenges, attachment styles and SEN needs? Is there any way to clearly distinguish, say for example, X behaviour is definitely an attachment style behaviour rather than arising from mental health or SEN challenges? So how do you differentiate?
That's a really good question. One place to kind of send you actually is to have a look at a thing called the Coventry Grid, which does a comparison between autism and attachment. And you're absolutely right, it's very, very difficult to be able to qualify one from the other. The motivations are sometimes quite different. And of course, people with attachment difficulties will have mental health problems, and that's absolutely a given, because they're kind of in anxiety all the time. And so with attachment disorder, for instance, a clinical psychologist would be the only person who can, or a psychiatrist, to diagnose attachment disorder. So if we have our doubts, we can also, always refer, if we're working with younger people, to CAMS or to adult services to try and get some sort of assessment done. So that is one way. But it's actually very, very difficult to be able to tell between those three. And of course, with SEND learners, they've missed out on so much. And so they're almost certainly going to have a specific learning difficulty anyway. And I think really, in some ways, it doesn't matter, because many of the things we talked about in working with attachment just now are also great, for people with mental health difficulties. So the regulation, the mindfulness breathing and things, you're probably going to get a catch-all really by using these techniques. So I hope that answered that question.
That's really helpful, thank you. We've just had one final comment come into the chat box asking whether you could include your case studies that you've run through today with the answers to the questions. So if I work with you over the next day or two, then if that's okay, James, we can make sure that everyone's got that additional information along with the recording. Is that okay?
Happy to, of course I would. Yeah, no problem.
Fantastic, thank you. Well, I think that concludes today's webinar, and thank you so much, James, because the feedback in the chat's really, really positive. Everyone's really enjoyed it, and I think got a lot from it. So thank you everybody for joining us, and giving the time. We do appreciate it's beginning of term and you've probably got a lot to do, so thank you very much. And as I said earlier, we'll send a recording of today's webinar along with those additional bits from James. So thank you everybody.
Sorry, Jane, just before everybody signs off, we just wanted to raise that we've had lots of people from across the communities of practice asking us around setting up some focus groups where we can talk as a small group about issues that you're experiencing currently within your colleges for learners with SEND, whether that be around the digital technology that you're using, or about those engagement strategies for learners that have really struggled to kind of engage back in education after they've been out for so long. So we will have the information coming out to you all. They will be quite small focus groups, but we're hoping to offer them quite regularly throughout the week. We've had some feedback around timings as well, that staff would like it, or you would like it at the end of the day, possibly from 4 till 5 or 5 till 6, so that people can have chance to talk to all other practitioners that are out there doing the work within the SEND community. So it'll be hot off the press. The information will come next week to you all, but they will be to the group sizes of between 8 and 12 of those focus groups. So then you can forward some of the things that you'd like on the agenda and we can let everybody know. So just wanted to raise that with you all before you log off, so that when you see the focus group information coming out, if it is something that you'd like to join, then you'll have context of what's that about. So thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you.